Whoopsie, forgot to do this one last week. Sorry about that, guys. That'll happen though. So we're going to talk about labor unions. This is the last piece that we need for this unit test. And as we try and wrap things up, I know this unit kind of wanders around a little bit, and I don't really like that either. But what we're trying to understand is the role of the private sector. In other words, the individuals within the economy. And so what we have left with is this idea of Walmart, these big corporations that, again, their goal is profits, and the best way to make, I shouldn't say the best way to make profit, but the easiest way to cut costs and make money is to cut labor, these input costs. And so you have these huge corporations that have the jobs, and then you have the workers that are providing the essential labor. Labor unions are an organization that tries to help balance out the power of the corporations and try and fight for their members. What they really are then is an organization. And their goal is to fight for pay and conditions. Now I have some examples up here that's not necessarily that important. Again, we need to think about more than just pay. Now there's three different types of working conditions that you can be under that deal with unions. The first is a closed shop. And this is where you have to actually belong to the union before they hire you. This exists in modern times. The easiest example would be the Screen Actors Guild or the SAG union. This is for people out in Hollywood. Before you can even get hired, you have to get your SAG card, your Screen Actors Guild card. So you have to actually be in the union before you get the job. And part of that for the movie industry is a little bit different because you don't have consistent work. You're always freelancing. You do a job here, you do a job there, you're off for 6 months, you do a job here. And so that's the only way they can get to do it. Second is a union shop. You have to join the union after they hire you. You have to join the union after they hire you. So you get hired, then you join the union, then you start paying your dues. We don't technically have a union shop in Minnesota for teaching, but it's kind of a de facto one in that as soon as you become a teacher, you have to pay some of the union dues, your fair share. So it's like if you're going to pay anyway, you might as well join it. This is the result of right to work laws. So I don't have to be in the union to be a teacher, but it doesn't make sense not to. The idea is, after a while, we had some concern about unions becoming corrupt, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but the idea that unions were forcing people to join. And so the idea is you should have a right to work whether you want to or not, and you don't have to join a union. Now, the main way that unions help you or fight for them is the idea of collective bargaining. My wife works at a bank. She goes in at the end of the year and they sit down and say, this is how you've done, this is how we see you. We think you deserve a 3% raise. So they deal with her individually. Unions collectively bargain. In other words, the union negotiates for me. I don't go sit down with Principal Johnson or Superintendent Collins and talk about, hey, this is how I've done for the year. I think I deserve this. No, we think you deserve that. That's not how it works at all. The union hires negotiators, or in our case, we have union members who are negotiators, and they go through and work on things like pay, conditions, benefits. And we have to understand a critical component to unions is not just the pay. How many hours do you work? Where do you work? Is there heating? Is there air conditioning? How much student contact time do you have? All of these different things. If there's a disagreement between union and management, we have a couple of options. The first is mediation. This is where we sit down and somebody comes and sits between us and tries to help us. If you've ever seen the beginning of Wedding Crashers, that scene with Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson where they're helping the people that are getting divorced. That's mediation. They don't make the decision for you. They help you guys negotiate. They help you make decisions together. Sometimes they go to arbitration, and sports fans have heard this, especially in baseball. Oh, he's arbitration eligible. That means that a third party, in other words, not either the boss or the worker, sits down and they actually decide how to settle the agreement. So in sports, we'll say, oh, the arbitrator awarded him $3 million a year. That means the team has to pay him $3 million a year, and the worker, the baseball player, has to settle for $3 million a year. I shouldn't say it that way, but you get what I'm saying. Settling for $3 million wouldn't be so bad, would it? Now, if they don't like the agreement, if they're unhappy, usually this happens before arbitration. Let me rephrase this. This always happens before arbitration. Both sides have options. For the workers, if they're unhappy with the contract offer, they can go on strike. And this is where workers refuse to work. the idea is that it shuts the company down, and then the company loses money because they're not producing anything. A lot of times, companies will then try and bring in what unions refer to as scabs, or non-union workers, to come in and try and make money. The problem for the company is that these aren't going to be as well trained, they're not going to be as efficient, and yes, they cost less money because the wages are lower, but they're still not going to be producing as good a product. The company has an option called a lockout, and this is where the company refuses to let workers come to work. A critical thing to understand here is workers do not get paid during a strike. So if you see somebody striking, they're not getting a paycheck. And then you stop and think and go, okay, how many people can afford to not work for 2, 3, 4 weeks? Imagine what would happen at your household if one of your parents stopped working, but you still have all of those same bills. Now, union membership today is very political, and this is because of who's in the union. What we see is only 12% of all workers are union members, meaning 88% of all employees in this country do not belong to a union. So we don't necessarily see a lot of sympathy for union members nowadays. Of that, private workers, in other words, people who work for companies, 7.4% of all private workers are in the union, which means, again, 92.6% of all workers in the private sector are non-union workers. In the 1950s, at its peak, 35% of all workers were union members. Remember, management is never part of a union. Plus, some fields like doctors, lawyers, will never or have never traditionally been in unions. Now, on the other hand, the public sector today, this is people who work for the government, people like teachers, firefighters, police officers, they overwhelmingly, in comparison to the private sector, belong to unions. Remember, public workers get their pay from taxes, which comes from people in the private sector. That's not to say people in the public sector don't pay taxes, but people in the public sector are net gainers when it comes from taxes, meaning they make more off of taxes than they pay in, simply because their salary comes from it. Private workers, then, we see a resentment between private workers and public workers, because the key reason you would join a union is to make more money, have better compensation. Union workers on average make 21% more than workers who do the same job in the private sector. In other words, if I'm in the public sector, I teach at a public school, I make more than if I taught at a private school, and that is true. It's one of the common misconceptions about teaching is they think, oh, if you teach at a St. Thomas or a Cretin, you make more money. Well, that's not true. In fact, that pay is substantially less, especially when you factor in things like medical benefits, time off, retirement, pension, that I get that you don't get at a private school. So we see this big disconnect between people who work for private companies and people who work specifically for the government. And you can see how unions start to fall out of favor. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to unions. In a union, you typically earn more money. In addition, you have more control over your hours, vacation time, overtime pay. We added 20 minutes of student contact, not 20 minutes to the day. See, you're in school longer this year than you were last year, 20 minutes. They added those 20 minutes. It didn't affect us as teachers as far as how many hours we're here, but it did affect how much time we spent with students. In other words, how much time we had to get other work done. And so for the school board to do it, they had to get the teachers to sign off on it because of our union. Overtime pay. How about this? I get paid when I substitute teach, even though I'm already in the building, because my contract says that is my time to get my work done. And so we see unions provide a variety of benefits. They also provide training. When we have staff development days and you guys have half the time off, a lot of that time is spent with us learning things that we need to maintain licensure. The idea is, why would I hire a union carpenter versus a non-union? Well, in theory, the union carpenter should be a heck of a lot better at his job because the union provides training and skill. Disadvantages. Large unions are sometimes really out of touch with their members' needs. This is not just true of unions, but any large organization. The bigger the organization, the less it knows what each individual needs because they're thinking about large numbers. This is the problem with teaching large classes. The more students in my class, the fewer minutes of time I can spend with each student. And so this becomes a problem. Same is true of unions. What I want my union to do might not be what the union spends its time on because the majority of members might want something else. This is the real downside for consumers and for companies. If I get paid more, the cost for the school district goes up. That means the school district can't hire as many workers, in this case teachers, which means as unions grow, unemployment grows. Now this is somewhat controversial, not everyone agrees, but if we're going to look at just basic supply and demand, as input costs increase, we're going to have a decrease in demand because the company cannot produce as much. So when I say demand, demand for labor, because the supply has, we'll just skip with that. Just stay with me here. Increased wages, my wages, are passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So as I get raises, as teachers get raises, what has to happen? What has to happen to taxes? Well, taxes have to go up. And so we see some complaint there. Again, it always comes back to there are always winners and losers in our society. The goal of a labor union is to help their members. And again, one thing you'll notice, nowhere in here did I say the goal of a labor union is to make a better product. It's not. The goal of the workers might be to make a better product. The goal of the workers might be to do a good job. But the goal of the labor union is simple: to create better benefits for more of its employees. There we go. Last point. And this is what has been going on in Congress, especially in states like Wisconsin. We're seeing a law in Minnesota. The unions use the seniority system. In other words, if they're going to cut a teacher, how do they figure out who to cut? It's not like a company where they can use a variety of factors, like how much they make, or are they productive, or can we eliminate a department. In general, in unions, what they do is a seniority system. So the last person hired is the first person fired. Have a good night.